Executive summary of it.
And by the end of the week.
And then what's after you start to make it
Thank you for coming. Yeah, well, we've been waiting too. I was like, are we ever going to hear this? First time to
do the right thing and get this.
Well, I'm done with my festival, but I had a whole year of festivals. I'm prepared to try back up, but no, now I'm done with theatrical.
Still in it.
I can't go into the details until it becomes Yes, absolutely. It's wonderful. Thank you so much.
I'm happy to welcome Manna Jo Greene.
And I also want to acknowledge Upstate Films. Yesterday was a magnificent film by John Bowermaster called Dear President Obama. If you haven't seen it, go look at the trailer, and when it becomes available, make a point to see it. It's one of the most moving films I've seen, documentaries. Pardon?
John's here.
And John is here. That's right, I saw him come in. A magnificent work. And for those of you who are not aware, Indian Point is becoming a yo-yo. First it's up and then it's down, and then it's up and then it's down. Most recently, a little over a month ago, there were 227 of 832 bolts inside the reactor that hold what are called the baffle plates to the former plates. And that's something that directs the water through the core of the reactor where the highly radioactive fuel rods are in fission. And they were either degraded, broken, or outright missing. What Entergy did was put a Band-Aid on it. They replaced those bolts and a few more to prevent what they call clustering of failure. But they did not get to the root cause. So the Friends of the Earth, Clearwater, and NIRS, the Nuclear Information Resource Service, filed an emergency petition requiring a root cause analysis. And that was ignored by the NRC. An appeal was filed, and unfortunately we lost that appeal, but we put forward a very good case. So this took about a week or 10 days, and then another leak was discovered. There have been many, many leaks over the years. This one in the cooling water, not in the reactor, but the cooling water that flows through the system to prevent overheating both of the reactor and of the fuel pools, where huge amounts of radioactive fuel rods are being stored at 4 to 5 times the original design basis. So we're on a trajectory to disaster with this facility. But I want to commend Ivy for having created a very balanced presentation. And thank you, and then we'll go right into the Indian Point movie. So I would at this time like to invite Ivy Meeropol, Marilyn Elie, and Roger Witherspoon to come up. What an amazing and magnificent film, and quite a few updates, but that'll come out in our conversation. I want to point out one thing that ties back to what I said earlier before we start our post-film discussion, and that is that, and as you can see, Entergy is not requiring Indian Point to do preventive maintenance. The Clearwater takes 40 children during the school season and charters over the summer out on the Hudson River twice a day. We are being required to do a restoration, a complete renovation of the Clearwater that's going to cost ultimately over $1 million by the Coast Guard. The NRC is essentially requiring no preventive maintenance for a facility that will that potentially can impact 20 million people or more living or working within a 50-mile radius. So there's some real discrepancy there. And with that, I would like to invite Blair Goodman to slowly walk up and down the aisles and ask if you will, as we have our discussion, contribute to the $100,000 we still currently owe and the other $250,000 we have yet to raise for future renovations that are Coast Guard mandated. And the one other thing I wanted to point out was that the chief engineer at the facility, Brian Vangor,
Senior control room.
the senior controller, he said something to the effect of, as long as the reactor is intact, we can replace everything else. Well, now the reactor is clearly no longer intact. The degraded and missing bolts that hold the baffle and former plates together that create the circulation of fluid through that system are not holding up. And that is a sign that the reactor itself is no longer intact. So I think just to bring you up to current. And with that, before we take questions, I want to ask if Ivy or our panelists want to just add a few words, what's on your mind right now. Thank you. Do you guys want to start?
No.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming on such a beautiful Sunday afternoon. Sometimes it's a tough sell for us to get people to pay attention to this issue and want to see a film about nuclear power, and we tried to make it as engaging and work on many different levels as possible, but it's a tough subject, and so we really appreciate that and coming out to support Clearwater. And you're getting an advance preview. The film is is opening at the Film Society of Lincoln Center on July 8th. We will have a theatrical, thank you. We will have a theatrical run there. So spread the word, anything you can do to help us get the word out, because as you know, if we can get people in the seats just the first couple days, they might even extend our run there. Ooh. We'll also be opening, yes, it's good incentive to get people. We'll also be opening in Los Angeles on the 22nd of July. So thank you. That's my plug, and off to Marilyn.
Oh.
Here, let's scooch down.
Why don't we all, we're just all moved down, so that's fine. Good.
Well, thank you for being here. I'm really not as angry and hysterical as one might think. While I may not be the voice of reason, I still do.
You got the front.
Well, thank you. I haven't done anything that activists haven't done for, I can't tell you, since the plant opened. You know, there is a long storied history of activism in this community and in the Hudson River Valley. And, you know, I'm standing on the shoulders of some really important people who have worked long and hard for this part to close Indian Point, to help the environment here, and also for many other causes. We have to stay vigilant, and we have to do something. I think that's the message that I would say to people. People can't always do the same thing. You can't always do as much or as you'd like to, but everybody can do something. And before we get off onto Indian Point, I would just say that as much as the governor wants to close Indian Point, he's trying to keep 2 power plants in upstate New York open. And this is a real mistake, because he's doing a nuclear tax. and he's sliding it in under the clean energy standards, and it's not too late to have your voice heard about that. So see me at the end if you need more information. Go to the Clearwater website. Manna has written a wonderful piece that is not exactly bedtime reading, but but it is very, very informative. So update yourself on that and really follow that, because it's a big mistake and it could have very far-reaching implications for Indian Point.
Before you, I want to ask you to shout your questions so we can hear, because we all have microphones.
First, I want to thank you very much for doing a film that really is a fair presentation of what's going on. Thank you, yes. The former PR guy for Entergy, Jim Steeds, is a personal friend of mine, and I know hundreds of people who have had concerns about the plants over the years. And I think you've done such a service, because this has become so emotional on one side and the other, and there's all kinds of issues. I have two questions. I've been told that there are new nuclear power generation technologies like third and fourth generation that where there's an instant shutdown of the plant and everything else. I have questions about that. And the other point I want to make, I think our U.S. government was so involved in this, because in the beginning they told all those nuclear power plant people, oh, don't worry about the rods, we'll take care of the rods. So thank you.
Thank you. I would say
Okay, with regards to next generation nuclear power plants, are any of you all old enough to remember the Jetsons? Yes. And around this time we were also to have flying cars and jetpacks. They're still right around the corner. It's the same with Generation 4 nuclear power plants. They may or may not happen one day around the corner. It is misleading and a waste of time to discuss them, because they do not exist. They haven't even gone through the diagram phase. They haven't gone to the part where the NRC is asked to even review schematics to see if it's possible to work. They're just pipe dreams at the moment. What you have to deal with is the 100 nuclear power plants that currently exist.
So now it's more like The Simpsons.
Without as much entertainment value.
That's true. Before we take another one, I want to answer more parts of that. One is Diablo Canyon is a really wonderful model in that they are phasing out, or committing to phase out over the next 9 years, and replace 100% of that energy with renewable energy. There's a difference here. We really need to close Indian Point immediately or sooner, and there is enough energy already available so that we don't need it. On the other hand, for future, we really don't want to be talking about building more nuclear power plants. We want to put the infrastructure in place as rapidly as possible. NYSERDA is doing amazing work with offshore wind. There's plenty of wind in the western part of the state ready to come on board, and solar is coming on board so fast we can't even keep up with it. The other thing I wanted to mention, which I think this gentleman touched on, is decommissioning. We are totally unprepared for decommissioning. There is a fund set aside, but that fund is based on the stock market, which, as we know, goes up and down. It's based because Entergy is what's called a merchant power producer. They don't have to have enough money ready for decommissioning. They can have a core of funds and hope that over time that will build up based on their investments. And that's not going so well. And we also haven't met with them and with the NRC to define a truly safe decommissioning plan, and a plan that also includes what we call just transition, where the workers are prepared for other jobs in the green energy economy. So just trying to give a little bit of information of the many, many things that we're working on.
Is there a projection on how long that would take to decommission?
Yeah. They have up to 60 years to do that. In theory.
60?
Yeah, and that's a start. Then there's another 60 on top of that. And the theory is that the decommissioning fund, which with Indian Point I think is around $390 million, and the projection is that they need something like $700 million to clean it, and even that's inadequate because it doesn't take into account the radioactive lake underneath Indian Point, which all would have to be removed. But the theory is that if you let the fund just sit in the stock market for the next 40 years, it would rise enough to be able to cover it. That assumes that the cost of doing things doesn't go up during that period also, but that's the theory, and that's what they operate on, and that's why it's allowed to just sit there in what's called safe store for the next 40 or 50 years.
We can do a lot better than Safe Store. What I wanted to follow up on Diablo Canyon was that they have a plan, and it included all the stakeholders, including union people, and plans for jobs and stuff, and that's the problem right now. Nuclear power plants are being looked at as job factories, and we can make plans for people's lives, and people can make their own plans for their lives too, but we still have nothing to do with that waste. So it's two separate things. As a community, we need to take care of our own. As a society and as a community, we need to stop making that waste. The other thing that I'll mention right now is the Bureau of Coastal Management report, which came out subsequent to Ivy's wonderful film. Bureau of Coastal Management has said that closing it, first of all of the electricity from Indian Point is not used in this area. Nobody runs, as some people think, an extension cord to the plant and then turns their light on. That's not the way it works. But the Bureau of Coastal Management has said, and they have it all outlined, that there is more than enough electricity in this area, in our area, in the area that Indian Point and Consolidated Edison serves, to close Indian Point without any more. We have a surplus, so we don't need to produce any more electricity. Not only that, it would be carbon neutral. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, because you hear so much about more greenhouse gases and gas plants being brought online. Closing Indian Point is carbon neutral, and we need no more power plants because we've got such a surplus. So keep that in mind and tell other people about that, please.
And if people want to come up and use the mic, you're most welcome.
Or we can just repeat the question too, if you like to stay sitting.
How can Indian Point be operating without a permit? I have two questions. And why isn't the federal government providing the repository for the spent fuel rods?
Okay, so the question's two-part is how is it possible that Indian Point can be operating without a license? And actually both, since the film was finished, now both reactors are operating without a license. And then the second part was, how is it that the federal government has not developed a federal repository for all that spent fuel? These are, yeah, sure.
With regard, did everybody hear the questions?
Yes.
Okay. With regards to their license, one of the rules that the NRC has is as long as you apply for a license at least 5 years prior to its expiration date, then you're allowed to continue operating until that process is completed. Now, with every other plant that's gone through the process, and that's like 75 of them, it has taken 18 months to 2 years to complete the review and relicensing process. The only one in the country that's taken longer than that is Indian Point, and that's been going on since 2007. And they can continue operating because they had applied in time, until this process is over, which there's no end date in sight at the moment. And as for Yucca Mountain, Yucca Mountain was never going to be able to hold all of the waste anyhow, but it was chosen because Nevada had one of the sites that seemed to be acceptable for a massive repository, and it didn't have enough political clout to prevent it being designated. As a result, they got stuck with it, and they've been fighting it ever since. And eventually, the politics changed, and Democrats took over, and Harry Reid became Senate President, and that pretty much ended that. The Republicans would like to revive it, and it's sort of sitting there as a half-finished hole in the ground, and there's no clear repository in sight.
And the sad thing is from what I understand, Allison McFarland, who became the chairwoman of the NRC after Greg was forced out, she's a geologist by training, right? Am I right, Roger and Marilyn? And was really tasked with trying to address this very question, and she felt strongly too that was the most important thing that the NRC could be doing right now. And then she resigned. We're not sure why.
Yeah. She was unhappy.
Well, mostly she didn't like hitting her head against a brick wall.
Well, of course. Who does?
So what the NRC is now doing is something called consent-based siting. They're starting a process that will be mediated by professional conflict resolution, mediation staff. Actually, it's not the NRC, it's the Department of Energy. Yes. So they want to see if there's a community that'll put its hand up and say, we're willing to take the nation's, or communities, the nation's high-level radioactive waste. What we are so far recommending is what's called hardened on-site storage, because we have very serious concerns about the transportation of this radioactive waste on the roadways or the rivers or by train across the country. So that's, it seems like every day there's a new challenge to keep on top of, but just that's the most current information.
Well, I just wanted to say that Manna has a little more faith in the consent-based storage than I do. I have seen that consent-based storage model used in Native American communities to take the people who are in power in the tribe who say, yes, we want the money. And it's not a very democratic decision, to say the least. And I've talked with some of the activists, younger people in those communities, who say, no, we don't want the waste. So even a consent-based kind of storage can be, or acceptance can be skewed in many different ways. So I just encourage everybody to stay very skeptical about that. I can't imagine any community actually wanting this to hand on to their children.
Well, there are some. I led a tour of journalists to a place called Waste Control Systems on the New Mexico-Texas border 2 years ago. And one of the experts that I took with me on this tour, and there were about 30 journalists, said it was the best designed facility he'd ever seen anywhere in the world, and that was his specialty. On the other hand, shortly after that, there was an accident in another facility in New Mexico where they literally got the wrong type of kitty litter that was supposed to surround the spent fuel rods, and as a result they had a small fission reaction that they hadn't planned on, and contaminated part of the storage area, which has yet to be fully cleaned up, and that has sort of put a damper on things. But Waste Control Systems still exists, and that facility would like to be able to host high-level waste. They could not take all of the nation's waste, but they could take a lot of waste. And the people there, whom we talked to, were quite enthusiastic about this particular facility and the jobs it provided, and were confident in the relative safety of that kind of storage facility. To put that in perspective, when you're driving there, you see rest stops, and many of us have driven long distances, and you pull into a rest stop and close your eyes for a while. There are signs next to these rest stops with little pirate flag, then says beware of methane leaks because there's also oil fields around there and there are pipes. And so when I asked, what are you supposed to be aware of? Well, if you take a nap there and there's a leak, you won't wake up. Oh, so I decided I wasn't taking naps while I was driving over there. But for folks who grow up in that region, in the Texas oil patch, where people literally die periodically from accidents and from mishaps, this is considered relatively safe technology and a relatively safe thing to do, which goes back to my statement in that film. It depends on what risks you're willing to live with.
Yes. Earlier in the week, there was an editorial in the Times Herald Record, which is a local paper in the region, regarding Indian Point, which said that the NRC was considering was likely to relicense it. And even though I know that Manna Jo, you just spoke to the other question, in the article it says that they would like to see the environmental community respond to the replacement power, the availability of replacement power should Indian Point go down. And my understanding has always been that we only use about 43 to 47% of the electricity that's generated. But we in Orange County are fighting frack gas, and just as you are, we are another victim zone or sacrifice zone, and we're fighting the CPV power plant and all that goes with it. But they're saying that CPV is part of the answer to Indian Point. We've been saying no, that's not the case. But now with the possibility of nuclear energy becoming not profitable and the two upstate facilities being in jeopardy of closing, can you just speak to these various questions, and where's a good resource that we can identify or document the fact that we have lots more electricity than we need, and it doesn't require the need for new frack gas power plants?
You should read my story.
The question is, do we really, and tell me if I got this right or not, the question is, how do we know that we really do have enough power? How can we say that when some of the politicians are saying that we need CPV to replace Indian Point, and what's the documentation involved? Yes, you should read Roger's stories, and they're on his website of Energy Matters. You should also read a really elegant report, which I referred to earlier, which is the Bureau of Coastal Management study. They have declined a coastal management report for Indian Point because of all of the reasons that we've been talking about. There's enough electricity, it's so harmful to the river. The list goes on, and you can see that they were writing this with an appeal to the court system involved, because that's where this is going to end up. But they list the power, they list what's there. Some of that power that they list is existing gas plants. Existing gas plants. What they're saying is we do not need any more gas plants because what we have is enough generation. And they also go into not just generation, but also conservation, demand response, improved transmission lines, and they talk about how much has been saved by improved transmission, and what's really important, and where solar comes in, is distributed generation. Roger has more technical information.
In the film, you saw Fred DeSimo speaking about how important the plant is. Right after that, he said the plant provides 25% of the electricity used in New York City and Westchester County. That's a lie. On a summer day, I don't know how else to categorize it. On a summer day, the peak load in New York City and Westchester County is roughly 13,000 megawatts. 25% of that is 3,250. A plant that makes a maximum of 2,000 can't produce that. Never did, never will. Secondly, it's a merchant plant. It sells electricity. It is no longer captive of Con Ed. So its contract with Con Ed is for 560 megawatts, period. That's 4.3% of 13,000. That's all. They sell the rest of it elsewhere, wherever they can. It does not go to New York City and Westchester County. It ain't going here. And so that's simply a lie. The issue about how important it is, the reason those plants, particularly the ones upstate, are losing money and are called zombie plants is because of competition. There are more than 300 power generators in the state of New York alone. In addition, there are 2 ISOs in Canada that interchange, that sell electricity and buy electricity between Canadian generators, mostly hydro, and New York. There are 3 connections to the PJM interconnect to the west, which is a 13-state region of Pennsylvania, Jersey, going all the way out to Illinois and Ohio. And there are 2 connections going over to ISO New England. And upstate, all those lines go through. And it is one of the most competitive electric markets in the country. And so those plants are zombie plants because of competition. And so if they die, it's not, you don't need to run out and build another gas plant. You don't need to run out and build a coal plant. They're dying because there's already more electricity available at lower cost than they produce. And if they die, they won't be missed. 3 years ago, the New York Power Authority declined to renew its contract with Indian Point. The New York Power Authority provides all the electricity for the subways, the airports, Metro North, the streetlights, public schools, and public housing. Nobody's missed it. And in 3 years, all that's been nuclear free.
I want to also give a forward-looking perspective. We've been thinking that the renewable energy economy is decades off, because decades ago it was decades off. But we're there now. And I will give you an example. This very area, Dutchess County, Ulster County, Greene, Columbia, Orange, all of the counties in this area are being deluged. The large landowners and farmers and land trusts are being offered solar leases in the 2 to 10 to 20 megawatt range. When we talk about scaling up solar, this is happening now. It's our job to help those folks be sure that the leases that they sign are not like the leases that the fracking industry offered, that they're protective and that the landowner has some say. There are lots of good places, closed landfills, brownfield site, all those flat roofs all over at malls and industrial buildings. There are a lot of good places to scale up solar in the region. We have to be careful that we protect our prime farmland, use marginal farmland, but these are the immediate issues that hundreds of people throughout our region are dealing with. And I'm not just talking about, crunchy granola tree huggers. I'm talking about planning board officials, zoning board officials, farmers, land trusts, etc. And I get calls several times a week and are able to direct people to lawyers who will ensure that the leases are wise and are done carefully, and we're working with the ag industry on this. There's also a huge amount of wind in the western part of the state. Part of the reason the prices are so low in the western part of the state is that's where Niagara Falls is putting energy onto the grid, and that's where wind is already in place. But there's a lot more potential to be developed, and that development can happen very rapidly if we remove any obstacles. And I want to say that some of us are actually meeting with the governor's office this week, and I'd like to be sure you can come along if you're available. The one thing that I would like to ask each one of you to do, and we'll take a few more questions, but in case people do have to leave, call your senators. Call Senator Gillibrand and Senator Schumer, and also your own congressional representative. Sean Patrick Maloney has called for the closing of Indian Point 2 and also Indian Point 3 to undergo a much more rigorous inspection. So he's already at the forefront, but what we're asking for is congressional hearings with independent experts to review this, to help us all understand how dangerous it is or isn't, and not just go by gut feeling or even history, but by the facts. And that's what a congressional hearing can accomplish. So if every one of you makes 3 calls, 2 to your senators and 1 to your congressional representative this week, we may actually get a congressional hearing, because everyone is very concerned about the faulty bolts inside the reactor.
Yeah, there's more questions. Yes.
Roger, I've read about a plant in New Jersey on a brownfield site for renewable energy using gas, and the claim is that the spent fuel, the water, could be cleansed. Do you know anything about that, and is there any possibility?
You're talking about a gas plant or a nuclear plant?
It would be a gas plant generating energy in New Jersey, and there's a German company claiming that any of the water that runs through the system can be reused again. Do you know anything about that? And it's been brought up with fracking water as well. A German company claiming that the fracking water can be cleaned and reused.
I can also grow wings and fly. You know, if you build enough filtering plants, you can filter just about anything. But then you run into the question of whether or not the gas you produce is still economically saleable, because you have spent so much money doing these other things to make it viable. I have yet to see a gas plant in New Jersey that's capable of doing that.
Well, it's a natural gas plant. My understanding, maybe I'm off.
No, one of the things that Christie has tried to do is to subsidize gas plant operations so that they can be the lowest bidder in the PJM market and be able to guarantee the sale of their product, with the state providing the margin, the financial margin, so that they're still profitable. Now, that's been shot down a couple of times by FERC, but they're still looking for ways to do that.
Federal regulatory people.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I just want to mention the issue of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. When it was established with an inherent conflict of interest. The primary mission was to promote nuclear energy, and a secondary mission is safety. We need an agency that's solely charged with nuclear safety. And I would hope that that would come out if we get congressional hearings, that would be a major message that we have.
Actually, the Atomic Energy Commission, which was set up in the 50s to promote civilian nuclear power, they're the ones that had the dual mission of promoting as well as regulating. And it turned out that that was untenable and they couldn't do it. So it was broken up into the Department of Energy and the NRC. The Department of Energy has the responsibility for promoting nuclear power and funding research into nuclear issues. And the NRC is supposed to represent the public. And its sole mission is safety. One can argue...
They shouldn't put it still in their literature. I mean, I've read it in their literature, that they're promoting.
The NRCs? Not the NRC.
The NRC, yes, the NRC.
I would be surprised at that. I have not seen that at all. The Atomic Energy Commission had that, but it was specifically broken up so that the NRC's mission is to represent the public. There's a discrepancy between that, because if you think about it, the guys at the NRC mostly came out of the nuclear navy, the same place that the guys in the nuclear industry came out of. And so they all have the same way of looking at this technology and how to run it and what is safe and what is not. And you get the split between the way the military looks at something and civilians look at something. And that's hard to separate, considering where they all came from.
Can I say something? Sure.
And it really doesn't matter one way or the other, because the result is the same, whether they're aligned or whether they're in sympathy or whatever, the results are the same. They do not protect public safety because they are looking out after the industry, from my activist point of view.
We could replay that wonderful scene in the film where Roger and Marilyn have a little disagreement. Yes.
But I do want to add that there is an institutional culture that has developed within an NRC, which is why Gregory Yatsko and Allison McFarlane were essentially ousted. That the staff itself does not want to have to answer to anyone that is going to change their way of doing business, which is waivers, exemptions, dismissing very serious issues, and putting the profit of the industry above public health and safety. And Marilyn knows that I gave them the benefit of the doubt for 5 years or so. I kept trying to believe that this agency was going to try to balance their dual mission. But time and time again, they have proven that they're incapable of doing that. And if anyone there tries to maintain their integrity, especially the example of Gregory Yatsko after the Fukushima disaster, when he tried to get them to implement a much higher standard of safety.
And also just to add to that, Greg would say that there are a lot of excellent staffers at the NRC who were ready and wanted to respond and worked with him to create those recommendations as fast as possible, which, as he says in the film, was a difficult thing to do. Which isn't to say that all the staff are, but I think it's safe. I think the onus line, the commissioners who orchestrated his takedown are really the villains here. Yes.
Yes.
Right.
So, regarding the way the movie you presented.
Could you talk louder, please?
Great movie.
Thank you.
As I'm watching it, I was trying to find dates. I was hoping for captions of dates of when things were being said, timelines. And I was a little bit lost within the timeline of when things were being shot or being shown and happening in the history. So without dates, I'm lost about understanding the history of this story. Now you're going to go to present it at festivals and things, and I'm wondering, if I were to show this to kids or a school, we'd be at a loss for explaining when did these things happen. Like Fukushima had 2011, but then there's all these things that I recognize from 14 and 15, and then there was, the end of 2015 is when the, license is up. Now it's running without a license, and then there's the sturgeon story, and then the river keepers doing these lawsuits with the fish thing, and then. So going forward, I'm wondering if in your follow-ups or your little web serial releases that you're going to do, right, of what's happening going forward, and if you were to show this in 1 year, how would we follow and track the evolution of all of the different angles that are presented in the film about how to shut it down, or is it going to get shut down, or is it going to get modified into some kind of 3-month offline thing? There's all these things I'm not sure how I'm going to track.
Right.
There's a recommendation bundled in that, but I'm also curious about the sturgeon story.
Well, I mean, all of it happened over the course of the 3 years I was filming. So it's post Fukushima. I started researching film actually right before Fukushima, and then when Fukushima happened, I said, now this is really urgent. And I became interested because of what we were talking about with the relicensing process, that I had read that Indian Point was the most contentious relicensing that application that the NRC had ever seen, and it continues to be, as Roger was talking about. So that drew me to the story. So I started at that time. So I mean, it's really over a couple of years, really, that you're seeing what's happening in the film. But we are going to have a pretty elaborate website, and we'll be linking to other websites, including Rogers, I'm sure, and Clearwater, and et cetera, and Riverkeeper. But it's a good recommendation. What I would hope we would do is say it's be updates, where do all of these legal battles stand, and what can you do to be involved. It's a tricky thing when you do a film like this. You want the audience to be immersed in the story, somewhat, and really have, and I believe in character-driven documentaries, and I have wonderful characters here. They're subjects, but they are characters.
Well, one of us is a character.
I don't know, Marilyn. But, and a most reluctant one, by the way. Roger, I had to work very hard to get Roger to agree to be in the film, and thank goodness he relented. But so yes, to your point, I think, but that kind of thing, a lot of putting text on the screen and graphic. I'm really not in, a lot of films that deal with complex issues put a lot of graphics up, dates, things like that. That was kind of a filmmaking choice, but I hear you that I think going forward it's a good thing for people to be able to track where we are.
Ivy?
Yes.
Nuclear power in general is an extraordinarily complex subject, and so you have multiple things going on at the same time. And what she found was a way of presenting them, but these have been ongoing. For example, dealing with the fish, the original license for Indian Point back 40 years ago said they needed to scrap the once-through cooling system that they use now and build a closed-cycle cooling system, a radiator system. And they didn't do it. They came across various alternatives, and the state just ignored it for decades until it finally came to a head. But it is not new. And I was reading, for example, one of the NRC's environmental impact statement that Fred DeSimo referred to in the movie that said there was a small to moderate impact on the river. Well, I read that, and it was a 700 and something page environmental impact statement, and somewhere around page 380, 390, it said that they had been killing 3 trillion with a T fish per year, and then in 1984, they installed what are called Ristroff screens, which reduced the mortality by about 182 billion with a B per year until it settled around 1994 at around 300 billion with a B per year. And so I called the NRC and said, I'm a little puzzled. How do you call 300 billion dead fish small to moderate? And the answer was the NRC doesn't evaluate the impact on a local system. It makes a comparative evaluation of how this stacks up against any similarly sized power plant of another type. And so if you have a 2,000 generator coal-fired power plant or a 2,000 megawatt gas-powered power plant on the same location, then you are likely to kill roughly as many fish, and therefore the impact of having a nuclear plant is small to moderate compared to any other system that is killing fish wholesale. It does not, however, deal with what is in fact the local impact. And the other half of that is you saw the water going back into the river. It is hotter, it's hotter, but I'm sure, but to give you an idea of how much heat they dump into the river, it is roughly the equivalent of the heat that you would get from exploding an atomic bomb every 2 hours, 24/7, 365. And if that seems odd, it's roughly 30 billion BTUs per hour. And the Hiroshima bomb released 57 billion BTUs. Okay, and you get that 24/7, 365. That alters the conditions of the Hudson River at its most productive place. Yes, sir.
And I think this will probably be the last question, time-wise. Steve, are we?
Yeah. Yes.
One of the big points Entergy and the pro-Indian Point people seem to make, the whole jobs point. I thought it'd be interesting if you guys have a few numbers on that. How many jobs does it provide, and how many jobs would be provided by decommissioning, for instance?
Well, there's 1,300 people who work at the plant.
Yeah, about that.
About 1,300 at the plant. I mean, and then obviously there's, you could talk about the tax benefits to the Buchanan, and Entergy also gives lots of money to whether it's the Paramount Theater in Peekskill or the fire department, Boys and Girls Clubs. They have many ways of inserting themselves into the community. They donated with the hospital, Hudson Valley Hospital, ironically enough, a cancer wing. And it's hard to say exactly what
it wouldn't. First of all, it wouldn't close overnight. So you're looking at a process. It would take several years to do that, and then how long does it take for decommissioning? And that process employs an awful lot of people over a long period of time. So you're dealing with attrition here. And now as to how many jobs there would be elsewhere and how do these professionals wind up going elsewhere, that's not really known. At various times, some of the union leaders have said they could find other jobs for their union members without any problem. So it's just not clear as to what exactly happens. Guys like Brian Wenger, for example, he has since changed jobs, and instead of being a control room operator, he's responsible for the spent fuel. And it would take years to move all that stuff into dry cask storage. And so he will continue doing that for years. Secondly, the land doesn't disappear, so it stays on the tax rolls, and Entergy is still paying taxes on it. They may not be paying as much because it's not a profit-making business, but you are still paying for the land, and you still have to pay taxes. They don't get to say, oh, we're not making money, bye. No, they do not. It stays on the tax roll. So exactly what the impact would be is not nearly as dire as the industry makes out, but it's not nothing. And that takes some time to actually evaluate and figure out.
And I would also ask that you, on one hand, weigh that and weigh what needs to be done so that people can continue with their lives with the lives of 20 million people who have not elected to work at a nuclear power plant, who have not elected to assume that risk. The lives of people in a 50-mile circle that are put at risk, and the property values, just say in New York City, for example, and what could be impacted there with not only your families, but you would even have an impact here. Even though you're out of the 50-mile zone, you would still have an impact. If something happened in that area, you'd feel it here, even if it's just people trying to escape. And, what's that worth?
I also want to say that we are absolutely committed to working with the unions and the workers to create a just transition, planning that together. And I can't go into details yet, but I think we found a path to do that so that this is that the handwriting is on the wall. This plant is going to close sometime in the not too distant future, and we want to be as prepared as possible. I said that was the last question, but I think you have one last, and this will
really be the last.
Bring us home.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank all of you, and I know there are many more people who have contributed their time, their energy, their hearts to this issue. We live down south. I taught in the Hen Hut School District. I taught in Peekskill, in Yorktown. It was really clear to us as teachers that we have a responsibility for the children that we care for each day. And it was also very clear to us that there was no way that an evacuation plan was going to work. If you take a look at the rush hour, there simply was no way. So any of us that taught knew that we would cradle the children if something happened, and there was no place to go. And I think most of us look at those evacuation signs and realize that it's like the emperor with no clothes. We know that that's not going to work, and thank goodness there are people like you that can speak very articulately about the science and all of that. But I think bottom line, we're really talking about the lives of many, many people if something were to go wrong. And it's just not worth the risk.
That's right. Amen. Be it so.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thank you all, and thank you to Ivy and our wonderful cast, and to all of you for coming out this afternoon. Enjoy, be well, support Clearwater, Riverkeeper, and I also want to give one final shout out to John Bowermaster. I thought I knew about fracking, and when I saw his film, I was just mortified at how ubiquitous the danger of fracking is. So we are all working with the anti-fractivists so that we create a fossil fuel and nuclear-free future. Thank you.
I saw a great big tourist bus of folks from out of town. For 40 days and 40 nights, they covered miles of ground. They had a map and compass, but they still were not arriving. Oh, they couldn't get to Pleasantville, so they kept on driving. And then one day the sirens blew, the county was aghast. It seems the aging nuke plant had an accident at last. The stockholders who fainted couldn't be reached for reviving. And they couldn't get to Pleasantville because there was no driving. The highways turned to parking lots from Albany to Queens. The politicians learned just what evacuation